What's up, y'all? Welcome to the What is Truth podcast. I am your most exquisite host, Mr. Weezy, and I am joined today by a fantastic panel featuring Dr. Raza, Mr. Sakib, and Mr. Robert Williams. Robert Williams being the amazing producer of that intro video. Let's start. Today's show will be about the Cold War, and it's good to be back in the saddle. So welcome everyone that's tuning in on the Apollo Detectives Rumble channel as well. Shout out to y'all. Dr. Raza, if you could give us a little introduction there.
Actually, I wanted to also introduce our guest here. His name is Sakib, and he is here in the same room with me. And he's a student at the university where I'm teaching. He is a foreign exchange student in China. So he's from Bangladesh. And you can call an Islamic scholar, means he's studied the Quran and traveled to many Islamic countries. It's important to have him here because part two of this show will be much to do with the relationship between China and various Islamic countries. And he's actually a very good person to speak about this subject because he is what you could say in charge of all of the foreign exchange students. So here in China, there's many foreign exchange students from many, many different countries. And he's very familiar with all the different countries which are sending foreign exchange students to China. And that's very important because it's relative to our subject about the relationship between China and these various Islamic countries. So we're very honored to have him here. It's a very special guest.
So my name is MD Najmus Sakib. I'm from Bangladesh, as my teacher told you, or professor in our university. So yeah, I'm just giving thanks because I'm being here. So yeah, I'm very happy with you guys.
Awesome to have you. And Mr. Bob Williams.
Good to be with you all here. Well, as you know, my name is Robert Williams, and I am the editor, director, and run owner of the Apollo Detectives channel on YouTube and on Rumble. And what I do is I take the information that people present and I illustrate it. So I'll take the soundtracks and I will go through the soundtracks and smooth them all out and remove all the ums, ahs, repeated words, things like that, and string it all together and put some graphical information there so people can see what we're talking about. But as far as the Cold War goes, I believe that it is really good to understand that so that you can understand what happened between the US and the Russians at that time, because it really goes right into the Soviet space race, and then of course the Americans have to try to catch up, and here we have this little conflict going. The question is, was it really a conflict? So that is something that Raza will get into probably a little later in the show. But in any case, we'll turn it over to Raza because he has a graph that he wants to show us.
I would like to divide this into two sections. I call the fake Cold War and then the real Cold War. So the fake Cold War is between 1961 and 1975, and then the real Cold War from 1975 to 1991. And we'll go into that later in the part two. But right now, we're just going to talk about part one, the 1961 to 1975 years. So to understand this period, what I call the fake Cold War. So in this graph that I'm showing you here comes from Wikipedia, and this is called the nuclear arms race. As you know, we had this so-called space race going on at the time, and there was also this so-called nuclear arms race going on at the time. So we can see from this graph that the red lines represent Soviet Union and the blue lines represent America and the so-called buildup of nuclear weapons. I added 4 dates onto the graph This is a very important because if you follow the blue line there, you can see that from the beginning, America had way more nuclear warheads than the Soviets did. The Soviets basically had none all the way up until just the beginning of 1960. And America already had a lot. And in the year 1965, America all of a sudden stopped the production of nuclear warheads. And then in 1967, they started decreasing the amount of nuclear warheads they had. And then at 1970, there was a brief period where they started increasing again, but then in 1973, they started decreasing. The reason why the Americans started decreasing their warheads was because there was an agreement between America and the Soviet Union. So the agreement was, we will let you guys win the nuclear arms race while you guys let us win the moon race. The Soviets knew that America was faking the moon landing because that was the agreement. America was supplying the Soviets with the nuclear arms. The Soviets would have had zero nuclear arms had it not been for America supplying them with the equipment they needed. So you can read Professor Anthony C. Sutton's book, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy, and he exposes how the entire nuclear arms race was a hoax because America was supplying the Soviets with not only the equipment they needed to manufacture the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they were also supplying them with the plutonium and the uranium and whatever they needed to build it. So the whole thing was a hoax that America was supplying Soviet Union with the nuclear weapons, and at the same time, the Soviets were pretending to be ahead in the space race until just at the end, and America takes the wind with the 1969 moon landing. So that whole thing was just a puppet show. They both knew that the Soviet Union was just pretending to be ahead. So anyway, I want to talk about these 4 important dates here that I have marked on this chart.
I didn't know much about the Cold War, so I'm excited for the information that you're going to share with us. And I just want to make a couple clarifications. What's the difference between a cold and a hot war? From what I understand, the hot war is where missiles are being launched, actual killings and deaths. The Cold War was essentially portrayed as an ideological war. I did run into a speech by Major George Racy Jordan that was made in the 1960s. And I want to play a clip of it, if you don't mind, Dr. Raza. It's only like 2 or 3 minutes long. George Major Racy, he was a veteran from World War I, and then he got promoted to sergeant during World War II. He's kind of like another Smedley Butler in many ways. He's a whistleblower. And he was put in charge of overseeing transactions between the Americans and the Russians. And there was certain deals in place that the Russians weren't allowed to use certain monies for this and that. And meanwhile, they were using it. And when Major George was trying to put it, hey, what are we doing here? He was told to shut up. He was told to retire and look the other way. I just wanted to preface this because there's probably people who are like, what are you talking about? A Cold War hoax? It was real. It was real. Hear it from Major George Racy's mouth so that if there's any doubt in your minds as to if this is all baloney or if there's any truth to this, I think this will settle a lot of doubt. So let me play it real quick.
He immediately assigned me to the Russian Air Force as an expediter under the Lend-Lease program, working under Harry Hopkins. And I was assigned to the Newark airport. It was at Newark that we were shipping a great many things by boat to the Russians, down around Africa and up into Basra, Persia. We were also shipping a great many planes lashed to the decks of boats that went up to Murmansk in northern part of Russia. And as I been there about 2 days, the commanding officer called me and he said that he had just discovered that I'd been a sergeant in the First World War. And of course, you folks all know that it really was the sergeants who really won that war. And so he wanted to assign me as the executive officer to the Newark airport. So I became acting executive officer with a great many different duties, but my main duty was to see that the Russians got whatever they were supposed to get under the Lend-Lease program. I immediately decided the first thing I should do would be to read the law. The law that your Congress had spelled out exactly what the Russians were to get. So I immediately consulted the act itself, and I found that your Congress had outlined that the Russians were to receive warfare materials only. They were not to receive any money for rehabilitation, and that they were also to get certain items that would be decided by the President of the United States. And the President promptly designated his authority to Harry Hopkins. Therein starts the story. Because as I had the Russians come in to call on me and ask me for various things, I had to refer to Washington to find out if they were supposed to get this or that. And my experience was rather odd, because the Russians came up to me and announced that they'd heard about this relief program in the United States. And would I please arrange right away to put them all on relief? Well, of course, I tried to explain to the Russians through an interpreter that the Lend-Lease program was an entirely different program than the administrative or relief program. So passing the buck, which is an old Army custom, I asked them to get in touch with their embassy, because I was sure that their embassy would teach them the facts of life. But I was the one that learned, because a few weeks later, this Russian came to me and he thanked me so much for having given him the information as to how to get this relief, because they had the relief that they wanted. And I said, well, now, I don't understand this. Let me see the papers, because I knew the law quite well, and there was to be no money for relief. But here the government had decided that because the Russians had asked to have the city of Leningrad put on relief, they actually put the city of Leningrad on relief. And when I started to see the amounts of money, I was so astonished that I decided that maybe I better start keeping a few notes, because I had remembered back in the First World War, there were some officers who went to jail for ordering saddles for the tanks.
He's breaking down truth bombs, George Carlin-esque. I mean, he's doing stand-up. Like, it's hilarious. He's telling crazy shit, like he's whistleblowing on all the crazy stuff that he saw, but he's doing it in a pretty funny way. It makes you chuckle, which is pretty amazing. Like, he's doing stand-up while dropping truth bombs. It's pretty wild. If you listen to the entire 15-minute speech, he talks about how the Russians asked for $100 million worth of vodka to be shipped over there. $100 million worth of vodka? I mean, it's pretty insane shit. So if anyone was on the fence, you just got a little taste. This is real shit. This isn't just people making things up and oh my God, you're calling the Cold War a hoax? Well, you just got a taste of it.
Actually, that was great. That was really great. Also, I want to mention that I did an interview with an ex-Soviet whistleblower. His name is Dimitri Khazov. I was fortunate enough to do 2 interviews with him, and we spoke about this Lend-Lease program. If you haven't studied the Cold War hoax, it goes back to 1917, okay? Because 1917 was when the Soviet Union got same private central bank, which America had. America got their private central bank in 1913, and the Soviet Union got their private central bank in 1917. So the whole thing was a puppet show. And America was transferring money and military equipment before the Lend-Lease. So before the Lend-Lease, there was what's called the 5-year plans. You can go to the Wikipedia article, the 5-year plans, and America was transferring. It began, of course, with Henry Ford. Henry Ford was the first one to build the Gorky tractor factory, which was manufacturing the tanks, So yeah, the whole thing was a puppet show. It was the same Wall Street bankers funding both sides ever since 1917. I want to come back to these 4 dates here on this chart. So we can see here, I'm going to go in reverse order. So starting in 1973, that's when America started their final decline of nuclear weapons, thus allowing the Soviets to pass them and the Soviets win the nuclear arms race. It was because America finally started declining in 1973. So what was it in 1973 that caused America to start declining was, of course, as most people know, Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords. That is the reason why, or the excuse you can say, why Nixon decided, okay, we're going to start decreasing. It's safe now. The world is a safe place. But really what was going on is there was an agreement that the Soviets were going to be allowed to win the nuclear arms race. So America would keep on supplying them with the nuclear equipment and nuclear materials to win the nuclear arms race. So let's come back. In 1970, there was something that scared America where they started temporarily increasing their nuclear arms supply. So that would happen to be China sending their first satellite into orbit. So China, by their own accords, was basically, the first country outside of the Freemasonry. When you talk about America, the Soviet Union, they're both controlled by Freemasons. If you've ever listened to my Dimitri Khazov interview, he exposed this thing. He said the chief of the staff of the Soviet Union, who was in charge of suppressing Freemasonry, he was a Freemason himself. So the theory that Freemasonry was so-called banned in the Soviet Union is total nonsense. It was the Freemasons pretending to be banning Freemasonry. So what did scare America was China being able to put their first satellite into orbit. So that happened in the year 1970. So let's come back now. 1967 was when America started their first decline of nuclear weapons. And so what caused that would be the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. That's when America and the Soviet Union signed the Outer Space Treaty, and America said, okay, it's safe now, we can start decreasing weapons. But we have to come back here to the beginning, 1965. That's when America stopped increasing. They stopped production. So this is the most important point of the thing. 1965 was when the agreement was made between America and the Soviet Union, where you let us win the moon race and we'll let you win the nuclear arms race. This is where it all began in 1965. And in 1965, this is when LBJ called up Brezhnev and, they made a deal. So this was just after they had installed the hotline. Kennedy wanted there to be a hotline from the White House to the Kremlin. And so that project started and was completed at the end of 1964. So at that time, the president of America could just get on the phone and speak to them in the Kremlin. They didn't have to meet face to face to make these kind of meetings anymore from 1965. They could just call each other on the phone. So this was the agreement between the Freemasons of America and the Freemasons of the Soviet Union, where they said, we've got some major things coming up. We have a Vietnam War coming up. We have a space race coming up, and we have a nuclear arms race coming up. So this was all planned out in 1965, the battle over Vietnam and who's going to win the space race and who's going to. So that was the agreement. America is going to supply the Soviet Union with the nuclear equipment and the equipment they needed to manufacture the nuclear warheads, and all the nuclear material was going to be supplied by America. And the Soviets were going to pretend to be winning the space race. And then at the end, America would take the lead and win the space race by being the first to land the man on the moon. So this agreement was made in the year 1965. And also what America told the Soviet Union is, we want you guys to start building the first space station, because in 1975, we're planning on shaking hands in space. So this was a Freemasonic symbol, the shaking of hands between the Soviets and America in 1975. So this was planned out in 1965. So what the plan was in 1965, we're going to pretend to be in this heated Cold War, where racing to get to the moon, the evil Russians are accumulating weapons, and the evil Russians are supporting North Vietnam. When you say the Cold War is a hoax, that implies that the Vietnam War was also a hoax, right? So definitely they had planned this thing out where America was going to be supporting South Vietnam and the Russians were going to be supporting North Vietnam. So this whole thing was planned out in 1965. So, and you can tell that from the amount of nuclear weapons which America had. That you can see them clearly in 1965. Okay, we can stop production now. We can start decreasing the nuclear warheads, and we can start supplying Russia so that they can win this.
Yeah, what I would like to know is, let's go back to the rocketry, for example, these rockets. Is it true that the Americans were actually purchasing these rockets from the Russians just about after Sputnik? I remember something about that, but is it true?
Right. So it's basically the gyroscopes. So when you talk about a rocket, whether it's a spaceship for humans or whether it's a nuclear weapon, it's basically the same thing, ICBM.
I thought it was the engines, though. It was the engines I was talking about.
Thing is this, okay, so you have, of course, Operation Paperclip and Operation Rasaviharii, where they just basically divided up the Nazi scientists. Most of them went to the Soviet Union and the special ones came to America. So they were hand in hand from the end of the World War II. At the end of World War II, that's when they grabbed the Nazi scientists. So there,
Right.
regarding rockets, there was the same group on both sides. It was the same group. So if you think about it, what was the space race? The space race was the first time that Nazis and Freemasons could work together. During World War II, the Nazis could not work with Freemasons, because Nazi Germany supposedly had banned Freemasonry. But then after the war, they made an agreement with these Nazis. It's like, okay, you're going to have to overcome your differences now. You're going to have to work with us Freemasons. And half of you are going to go to America and half of you are going to work in the Soviet Union. So that's really what it was. It's just regarding the rockets and the sharing. So definitely the Soviet Union intercontinental ballistic missiles were using gyroscopes that were built in America. The Soviets wouldn't have one single rocket had it not been for America supplying them with gyroscopes.
Yeah, I remember something about that when we did that documentary together. It was Operation Rasaviharii, when they were getting off the train in Russia. So those scientists that were captured, I remember all of that. But it was just interesting, all the money that was funneled into those projects back then. And you didn't really hear about it. It was kind of hush, 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 which you can't blame them.
All right, so let me jump into the next section. This is what I'm calling the period from 1961 to 1975, what I'm calling the fake Cold War, meaning that there was just a puppet show going on between America and the Soviet Union. There was no hostilities. There was the same Freemasons in both countries building rockets and stuff like that. So to clarify this point a little bit, I call it a fake Cold War, meaning that it was simply a puppet show. But there actually was some hostilities between the year 1961 and 1963. And those hostilities were against Kennedy. So what it means is that in between the years 1961 and 1963, there actually was sort of a Cold War going on, but it wasn't a Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. It was a Cold War between Kennedy versus America and the Soviet Union. The Freemasons of America and the Soviet Union were very upset at Kennedy. They had to get rid of Kennedy. So this all began in the year 1961 on April 27th. So on April 27th of 1961 was when Kennedy delivered his secret society's speech, where Kennedy says that we have to be careful about these secret societies. And that really pissed off the Freemasons. So from April 27th of 1961 was when there sort of was a Cold War going on, and it was a Cold War between the Masons and Kennedy. So then what happened after that? So in the March 17th, Israel breached the General Armistice Agreement in violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 162. This is an important date, important thing I think people should research about this UN Security Council Resolution 162, which kind of had drawn the line in Israel and Palestine. Israel just went ahead and breached that line anyway. So that was just, a few months after Kennedy gave his speech. So next date is May 4, 1961. This is when America had an astronaut riding in a balloon. A lot of people don't know about this, but before NASA started building rockets to send people up into space, they had been trying to send people up into space in the giant balloons. This is a long story because it goes way back. When you talk about the Cold War hoax, you can also study how the NASA and the Soviets were using these balloons to bounce radar signals off. So you can also tell that the Cold War was a hoax way back by studying this balloons thing. By 1961, had to put a human being in one of these balloons. And that human being made the first 10-hour flight into space. He reached an altitude of 34.67 kilometers, which was the highest any human being had gone. And he had to have a special spacesuit on. So this was how the space race really began, was not by rockets, but actually by balloons. They were designing the spacesuits for the people to go up in the balloons. So next date is June 4th, 1961. What happened was Kennedy was going to meet Khrushchev. It was called the Vienna Summit. So in the Vienna Summit, Kennedy met Khrushchev, and the Freemasons who were controlling Khrushchev told him that you should not be friendly with Kennedy at all. So the Vienna Summit they called the failed summit. And that's when they say the Cold War really picked up. Yeah, of course it picked up because the Freemasons were very pissed off at Kennedy for giving this speech about secret societies. So anyway, there was this failed Vienna Summit, which led to an event called the Berlin Crisis, which they called this the heated, when the Cold War started getting really hot. But that whole thing was a puppet show. Of course, Khrushchev was not going to be allowed to become friendly with Kennedy. Then what happened next was that in August 1961, the Soviets announced that they would continue nuclear weapons testing. They told this to Kennedy. Okay, it's like, the Soviets are going to start blowing up nuclear missiles again, so we have to start testing our nuclear missiles. From September 10 until November 4, the Soviet Union conducted 11 nuclear bomb tests. And then on September 15th, 1961, the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Secret Services, told Kennedy, the Soviets just launched all these nuclear tests. So Kennedy had to sign the paper so that America could start their nuclear testing again. So you can say Kennedy was tricked into signing the go-ahead for America to continue nuclear warhead testing program. And that happened on September 15th of 1961.